In 1878, Josiah Henson returned to the Riley Plantation, his former place of enslavement, in Montgomery County, Maryland, and describes the scene he encounters. The once great plantation is now but a wilderness, the most desolate, demoralized place one can imagine. The fertile fields where once waved acres upon acres of tasseled corn, of blooming rye, and oats and barley. The once plowed land where grew the endless rows of potatoes, which I have hoed so many weary hours. The rich pastures where herds of cattle used to graze. All of these splendid lands are overgrown with trees and underbrush. The fences are all gone, the fruitful orchards worn out and dead, and when we drove up the last grass-grown road to the house, I saw at last standing there all alone, without a single barn or stable or shed to bear it company, and it was such a dilapidated condition that the windows rattled and the very door sprang ajar as we drove up and stopped before it. The plantation he returns to was a far cry from the place he remembered when he was held in bondage, and the land he had continued to undergo a tremendous change over the subsequent years. The archaeological research conducted at the Josiah Henson site focuses on uncovering surviving elements of that plantation and the landscape inhabited by Josiah Henson and the others who were enslaved on the property prior to the Civil War. As our research progressed, we also have been able to see archaeologically how the landscape was altered by succeeding occupants, mirroring the larger trends in Montgomery County over the last 200 years. I was born June 15, 1789. This is how Josiah Henson starts his slave narrative. He goes on to describe his early life in Charles County, Maryland, his sale to Adam Robb of Rockville, and then his trade to Isaac Riley for the price of horseshoeing services. He describes growing up on the Riley plantation, marrying a young slave woman from a neighboring plantation, hearing a preacher at nearby Newport Mill, and beginning his lifelong relationship with Christianity. As an adult, Henson tries to buy his freedom, having raised money through preaching. Isaac Riley deceives him, and it is at that point that Josiah decides to seek his freedom in Canada with his wife and family. Once there, he settles in Ontario and helps create the Dawn community for other freedom seekers, with a school to educate, a church to enlighten, and a lumber mill to provide employment. It is here at Dawn that he dictates his life story. He couldn't read or write until later in his life, and publishes it to raise money to buy his brother John out of slavery. It is this narrative that Harriet Beecher Stowe, an abolitionist from a prominent family in Boston, reads and uses as an inspiration for her main character in the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. This association between Henson and Uncle Tom's Cabin will be with him for the remainder of his life and into today. Later in his life, he becomes a celebrity, traveled to England more than once, met with Queen Victoria, and later President Hayes after the Civil War ended. But it's his experiences on the Riley plantation that were so influential to demonstrating the realities of slavery to a larger white audience, many of whom would deny that slavery was anything but beneficial to slaves. The Josiah Henson site is located just north of Washington, D.C. The Josiah Henson Park consists of about 3.5 acres within a suburban neighborhood south of Rockville and contains the core of the original plantation. The Riley House, constructed between 1810 and 1815, and the log kitchen, built in 1850, are the only remaining 19th century structures on the property that once would have had numerous outbuildings. After the initial purchase of the Riley House, additional properties were acquired by Parks to provide space for a museum and visitor center exploring the life of Josiah Henson and to slavery within Montgomery County, as well as to preserve archaeological features. In this image, you can see a structure just to the south of the Riley House, which has recently been demolished, and a visitor center now stands there as part of the museum construction. Think for a second what you think of when you hear about slavery in the United States. What images do you conjure up in your mind? Large white pillared plantation houses on large expansive plantations of miles of fields? Maybe you're thinking of large groups of slaves in cotton fields. Today, I want to share with you a site that represents another much more common form of enslaved experience, one where a smaller scale of slavery was a common and standard part of the 19th century American culture. Slavery was an economic system designed to accrue wealth and status for the slave owners. It may be tempting to think of slavery as only promoted by a few wealthy elite who owned large plantations like those often portrayed in movies. In reality, slavery was commonplace prior to the Civil War almost everywhere. In Montgomery County, almost half of the population was enslaved, and most lived on smaller plantations or in houses as cooks or servants. Most slave owners in the county owned fewer than 10 slaves, most holding only 1 or 2 in bondage. This arrangement contributes to the invisibleness of the enslaved, since they are not housed in separate accommodations that can be seen. There is little trace of them other than possible references in documents, in contrast to a larger plantation where dedicated housing is clearly visible on the landscape. The Riley Plantation was a more typical example than those large estates with hundreds of slaves. Riley owned more than the average number of slaves for the county. He usually owned between 10 and 20 slaves throughout his life. It varied from point to point, but never was at the scale of the very wealthy. This makes the site a significant one to look at archaeologically, since it lets us look at slavery on a plantation that was not part of this 1% and not often recorded. It's also unusual in that our primary source is Josiah Henson himself. So we are learning about life on the plantation from the enslaved experience. Henson writes and produces several editions of his life story, 1849, 1858, 1881 being the most widely read. His descriptions of the intangible aspects of his life and the other enslaved community members are rich with detail and provide strong source material for interpretation when matched with archaeological resources. Here he discusses how he became the overseer for Riley after the white overseer was found to be cheating the owner. Henson comes to be responsible for the running of the plantation, the sale of the crops at market, and the care of the other enslaved. Unfortunately for us as researchers, very little documentary evidence other than Josiah Henson's words related to the Riley plantation survive. Many of the specifics of the plantation the date the house was built, when the additions were made, the number and kinds of crops raised, purchases made, ledgers are unknown due to the lack of primary historical resources. Research indicates that the property was several hundred acres in the early 19th century and shrank in size as the century wore on, apparently as an indication of the economic struggles the Rileys had after Isaac orders Henson and most of the slaves to go to Kentucky to avoid being taken as part of a lawsuit with Isaac Riley's brother-in-law. Though even in 1863, it was over 270 acres. The area was farmland until the mid-20th century, and you can see from the aerial that the area became highly developed as part of the suburbanization trend that the county experienced mid-century. Lux Manor neighborhood grew up around the Riley house and was built on top of much of the original Riley plantation. As part of this trend, the house and grounds underwent a significant renovation in the 1930s, obscuring the agricultural history of the property. At least on the surface, after being sold out of the Riley Mays family in the 20th century, the property changed hands several times until purchased by the Boltons. The Boltons reinvented the property to a colonial revival appearance, changing the facade, adding a screen porch, and a large addition in the back of the main house. The log kitchen was renovated and connected to the main house. Previously, it was a detached structure. The highly developed nature of the property caused some concern about how much of that 19th century landscape could have survived. So after Montgomery Parks bought the property in 2006, archaeological work began. Since 2009, over 150 units have been excavated across the core of the site, including a number within the log kitchen itself. This map represents the units completed into 2019. While cataloging and processing materials is ongoing from recent fieldwork, we have so far recovered about 30,000 artifacts and more than 200 cultural features that span the entire 200-year time period that the site has been occupied historically. Much of the work, field and lab, was completed with the help of volunteers, and this site has been the focus of a great deal of public archaeology. Just to orient you on this map, the Riley House is the building to the north, and to the right-hand side is Old Georgetown Road, and the whole map is oriented to the north. So today I'm just going to share a couple of the areas that we looked at. The first is about 150 feet south from the main house. Most of the original units that were placed throughout the backyard indicated that there was just a general yard use with a scattering of historic artifacts in the central area. The block of units at the very southwest corner of the park's property revealed a significantly higher concentration of artifacts and features that we explored further. These units showed concentrations of architectural debris, significant nails, brick, window glass, and we expanded them and encountered significant quartz rubble and structural features. Quartz rubble related to likely a chimney collapse. Several post holes and a long trench were also uncovered, that's shown here in a dashed white line. The features were located about 2 feet below the current surface, which is much deeper than the rest of the site. and there appears to be two distinct episodes of use based on the stratigraphy and the artifacts. The trench is about 16 feet long and comes to the corner at one side, and the extent of the foundation has not been uncovered at this point. Within these areas were domestic artifacts dating to the early through mid-19th century, and a handful are shown here. Everything from iron cooking kettles, buttons, food storage, crocks, marbles, tobacco pipes, ceramic tableware, and personal items such as thimbles and bar pins. Limited faunal remains were recovered since the soil on the site is so highly acidic and it is not good for bone preservation. There was never any indication that anything was significant at this location based on documents or oral history or even on surface examination. And now that we have evidence of a building we lived in by someone during the first half or so of the 19th century, potentially including a family, we have to ask ourselves who was living here. Isaac and Matilda and a relative are in the main house, and there are up to 20 slaves on the property during this time, so it could be a slave quarter. Though both based on Henson's descriptions of the slave housing being located as a village of log huts, and on practical concerns, there would have needed to have been more than one structure housing that number of people. We subsequently have tested on 3 sides of this area and found no evidence of another structure, and the artifact densities drop off significantly. The remaining side we haven't tested is on private property and inaccessible to us. This suggests this was an isolated structure, and the only other person that was likely to have been living on the plantation was an overseer. Hired to manage the day-to-day operations of the plantation, overseers were often given housing as part of their arrangement. So this could be the overseer's cabin. There is no record in the historical documents of an overseer except as part of Henson's narrative, where he describes becoming the overseer himself. Importantly, while not explicitly stated in Henson's narrative, it does appear that when he took over as overseer, he also moved out of the communal quarters he described before. Josiah Henson then goes on to describe how Riley at times would come into his quarters to talk about his legal troubles with his brother-in-law, among other concerns. He specifically describes the night Isaac asks him to go to Kentucky with the other enslaved. It is unlikely that Riley would have had such an intimate conversation like that in the communal quarter with 8 to 10 other slaves present. So it is a reasonable inference that Henson and his family, at this point he had a wife and 2 children, moved into a private quarter. Is this then the location of the Henson family quarter, or was this occupied by a later overseer or unknown family member? It is certainly one of our top research questions, and our work of this area is on hold because of the construction of the museum, and this area has been preserved. We will return to excavations here in the future. Of all the locations on the site, the log kitchen has generated the most interest, and for archaeologists, the most exasperation. Based on dendrochronology, the structure's logs date to 1850 and is adjacent, though detached from the main house. The log structure is often referred to as Uncle Tom's Cabin incorrectly by locals and visitors, though it was not built until 20 years after Josiah Henson left the property in 1830 and was not his living space. Likely, there was an enslaved cook who would have lived and worked here, and this space would have served as the heart of the Riley plantation. During the 1930s, a wooden floor was added, and the space was converted to a family den by the Boltons. You can see here Mrs. Bolton is in a rocking chair by the hearth in this newspaper article from the time. As part of the museum project, we removed the 20th century additions and excavated within the interior. We didn't know for sure what remained after the renovation work, if the hearth was present below the wooden floor, if the original dirt floor was present. As part of the wood floor installation, the hearth area was filled with concrete and debris and the whole thing was filled to support the wooden floor. Once we removed all that, what appears to be the original hearth is in fact present under the concrete. Once the wooden floor and concrete were removed, we began excavations in the northern end of the log kitchen. Our design for the space for the museum includes preserving half of the interior under fill, exposing the other half for visitors to see, including the profile showing the stratigraphy we encountered during excavations. We also found that the 1930s renovation was extremely intrusive, and the foundation walls had been excavated out and reinforced in place, and any original context related to the 1850 construction was no longer visible. You can see here the base of the east wall where poured concrete lies at the base of the trench. Just just about the entire perimeter of the foundation was involved in this 1930s renovation and when was impacted by it. In addition, there were 3 large concrete footers that were added down the center of the log kitchen to provide support for the wooden floor. The footers were dug directly into the soil and disturbed a large portion of the interior. Much to our disappointment, we encountered extensive rodent burrows around the footers and the foundation trenches. Often the most interesting artifacts we found were actually in the rodent burrows. Outside of these areas, however, there was limited sections that contained stratigraphy predating the 1930s. I wanted to show a short video of a time-lapse video we made of excavation of one of the units when we were excavating the lower layers within the log kitchen. We were coming down on a very dark, thin layer that contained a significant amount of charcoal and was the lowest cultural level in this unit. A number of the artifacts recovered from this layer showed signs of high heat exposure, suggesting there may have been a fire in the building at one point. And you can see that the dark soil will show up and actually covers most of that unit. The artifacts recovered from these lower layers were often not diagnostic chronologically, resulting in very broad dates for the layers. Even given the high level of 20th century intrusion, we were able to recover a range of the artifacts related to the use of the space as a kitchen. Bone and eggshell, some ceramics and glass, found marbles, doll and domino fragments indicating children are likely present in the space. It was not uncommon for children too young to work in the fields to be present in the kitchen, and certainly would have reflected the use of the space as a den later on. The space served as much more than just a place to prepare food. It was the heart of the activity on the plantation, and numerous things took place in this space at once: cooking, sewing, childcare. We'll be returning to the log kitchen next week, actually, to finish the excavations. In addition, artifacts from this space can be seen that as it was used as a recreation space: chess pieces, vinyl records, 20th century smoking pipes. As a visitor, you'll be able to learn about the archaeological work as you hear audio tracks about experiences of former slaves living and working in the kitchen of a plantation. All of this archaeological work is part of a larger research and interpretation project by Montgomery Parks with a focus on Josiah Henson and the enslaved community and slavery in Montgomery County. A new visitor center is being constructed with an auditorium and exhibits. The Riley House itself is being renovated and prepared as an exhibit space and not a historic house museum. The exhibits will be installed on the ground floor and will come in 2 styles, one called the Parks Voice, which talks about historical research, and the other, the Henson Voice, which tells Henson's story from his own perspective, using original artwork from a graphic artist. This is one of the panels that talks about when Henson is separated from his mother, what he considers to be one of the most traumatic experiences of his life. The content is all from his perspective, and the drawings are originals. While active excavations have been on hold at the site, we have been monitoring construction for unexpected finds. And during the installation of one of the water lines from the museum, we had an unexpected find. Within the wall of the waterline trench, we found a 3 feet deep, 5 feet wide, stratified, very rich feature. We documented, recovered what was in the trench, and preserved the remaining sections. The feature is at least partly wood-lined and contains alternating layers of rich organic material and sterile subsoil. Originally thought maybe it was a trash pit, it has become clear during excavation of even a small section that we've exposed that is more likely a cellar that was later used as a refuse area for kitchen scraps. Hundreds of fish bones, scales, and other faunal material were recovered, along with various ceramics, bridle boss, thimbles, straight pins, and coins, including a 1749 Britannia coin. Most interestingly, the artifact assemblage predates 1815, which is the earliest known occupation of the site when Isaac Riley was supposed to have started living there. And so this seems to represent an earlier resident, opening up a new set of research questions for the future. If this is in fact the cellar foundation or some other foundation, where's the original, the house that they were living in? Where is it possibly? Was it possibly hit during the renovations of the 1930s of the original Riley house? One half of the feature was excavated and screened traditionally. The other half exposed in the trench was taken as a 100% sample for flotation. Justin McKnight processed the samples and, based on the large sample size and funding constraints, developed a limited sampling strategy for analysis. The initial results indicate the presence of edible plants, crops such as corn and wheat, and large quantities of charcoal, likely from fireplace sweepings. As funding allows, the remaining samples will be processed, as will the large fraction. As part of our investigations of Feature 258, which is the trash cellar pit, the area around it was exposed to define the boundary, as the area where and also where the visitor path would be going. As we exposed that area, we found a large layer of rocks, and once we completely exposed it, we realized it covered a 20 by 30 foot roughly area. When compared to the 1927 aerial, it is in the same location as the original farm road, which likely would have been dirt. And it looks like this appears to be the base of where the farm road was, and like much of the house and landscape, was seriously fortified as part of the 1930s renovations. So along with the work that they did to strengthen and modify the Riley house, they also did the same to the landscape of the property and created this area, which later became part of the drive. Once exposed, we worked with our project team to redesign the visitor path and the drainage areas to preserve both this roadbed and the trash pits feature, and the road will be open to visitors as they explore the site when the museum is open. In closing, I'll return to Josiah Henson's words as he remembers the Riley Plantation in his youth, when it was a large and bustling enterprise he experienced. He says, "I saw the great house, well furnished and sheltering, a happy, luxurious, and idle family. I saw the outdoor kitchen where the colored cook and her young maids prepared and carried the dinners into the house. I saw the barns and storehouses bursting with plenty, the great cellars filled with casks of cider, apple brandy, and fruit. And the plainer than all I saw was the village of huts." This interpretive panel developed for the museum is drawn directly from the archaeological and historical research and brings to life the activities that he describes and we've encountered as we excavated and researched. Harvesting crops, processing meat, taking crops to market. All activities performed by the enslaved. While we do not have those stories in writing, we have recovered the material remains of their lives through the archaeological and historical work. The Josiah Henson Museum is opening December 5th, 2020. Thank you.